So I've seen quite a lot of people the past 24 hours that I haven't seen in quite a while. And I haven't seen them in quite a while simply because while 10 years ago I was working with Ivan on a project which led to our book Nationalism After Communism, published by CEU University Press, in the last 10 years I haven't done much on Balkans and nationalism, simply because in many, many ways I thought that, you know, they were out of fashion, and that nobody was any more interested in them as they had been in the 90s. And therefore, I moved on to my corruption work, on which I will not mention very much today. In fact, I won't mention anything, simply thinking that this is really past. And I continue to work a bit on EU integration, simply because I'm an East European, so even from Berlin, I kept a little bit an eye on performances of EU integration. But the problem was sort of brought to my attention 3 or 4 years ago, when I had to evaluate projects for the European Commission on one of those big European framework calls, on which the main theme was on European identity. And it was that very strange year, if you remember, the volcano days in Europe, when we had all this ash on the European clouds and flights were not flying. And I was on my sabbatical in Oxford, so I managed to get to Brussels. I managed to get to Brussels by Eurostar. And once in Brussels, I discovered that only 2 other people had got there before me. So in the 3 of us, we had to read all these papers dedicated to nationalism on European identity, what the best in Europe had put together as projects to get some EU money for their research. So we were really, really very busy. From morning till night, we didn't have time to see absolutely anything else. The call was written by some bureaucrats at the European Commission, as it always does. They are seldom written by scholars, or shown even to scholars who might sometimes remark if these are really scientific objectives or not. And therefore, the call basically encouraged scholars to see how the symbols of European identity, like the European capital of Brussels, like the European blue flag, and like the European hymn. You know, we're having a EU hymn. Yes, Beethoven's the 10th, that is our hymn, right? How have they impacted on national identities around the continent and on nationalism itself and changed it, right? So this was what people were asked to study and report about. And I can't tell you exactly what was in this project because I would disclose professional trust, but in my 4th or 5th day, in the morning, because there was absolutely no other time, in the reception desk, I see something on television. I see on television these nice people in a very fine room, such as this, and a quarter of the room just stands up in this funny clothes, and they start singing something which really seemed like something patriotic. It didn't seem to be from the film. It really seemed to be in the news. And I asked the receptionist, what the hell is going on TV? And he says, oh, this is the Belgian parliament yesterday. These are the Vlaamse bloc. They just want independence, you know, or something like this. So I go to my colleagues at the evaluation and I say, guys, whatever we're proposing to ask, the answer is before our very eyes. It seems that the capital of Brussels, at least, has absolutely no impact on nationalism, national identity, or whatever. And the evidence is out there. We don't need to pay millions of euros to find this out. So I would sort of start my, my after-lunch Friday talk by saying that, you know, of all national projects in Europe, the one which is undisputably failed is building Europe as a nation. We have definitely failed in doing that. And I think that in many, many ways, this was not an extremely smart attempt altogether. If you look around Europe, you see that, you know, that nationalism in many ways thrives in United Europe. Have you been to Scotland recently? Everyone, I mean, if you go in the Basque Country or in Catalonia, you hear conversations on the street. It's not just programs of certain elite groups. It's people talking, you know. You go in a tobacco shop and I hear people speak, and they speak about autonomia. Come on, I'm Romanian, so I understand Spanish, and Catalan even better than Spanish. I discovered that Catalan is the next to Romanian, because it has a lot of French words, so it's very close. So a lot of, you know, old Europe nationalism have been thriving due to the European Union, due to regional funds in particular, which encouraged local elites, you know, to develop basically economically and to develop their power base. They also, you know, came forward with these very, very strong regional nationalism demands. You know, in the Balkans, we know, I mean, I'm always had very big sympathy for Montenegro, so I'm very happy that now we really have a Montenegrin nation. To be honest, they deserved it after they've been forgotten last time when Yugoslavia was created. But also, if you look at old nations in Europe, I mean, Hungary, you know, speaking as a Romanian, I'm a natural monitor of nationalism in Hungary, right? But I'm also a natural monitor of nationalism in Romania, to be honest, but that is really like part of my job description. But I am impressed with Hungary. I'm impressed that nationalism is doing so well after so many years in the European Union. I'm not, you know, making any comments. I'm just remarking that this is the case, right? Okay, and this is within EU already, right? What happens during accession? Well, during accession, I was more optimist when we wrote our book. My part was called Milosevic Voters, and I sort of tried to understand the appeal of voters. Why do people vote for nationalist leaders, and why do vote for them again after their country goes through such rough times? And in the end of the day, I was rather optimistic, because I thought that this variety of nationalism that we saw in the Balkans and that we still see today in former Soviet Union actually has a very strong communist authoritarian gene. And I thought that this will wear out more and more, and this particular variety will change or will diminish. And in particular, I thought that it is very weak when competing against some other self-interested based project, because nationalism is a self-interested based project, like EU integration. And I think that very much this is what happened in the Balkans, or what happened in Romania, or what happened in Bulgaria, where the nationalist debates that we had 10, 15 years ago are completely gone. I mean, again, except for the Hungarians, they are still, some of them, discussing in Romania issues which have nothing to do with rights, but they still have to do with identity. But we presume that it is because of a lot of competition between Hungarian politicians, so they have to come up with something to distinguish themselves. Otherwise, I thought that European integration as a project, right, worked fairly well as to actually turn even nationalists, and we see this in Serbia, you know, we see this in Serbia today, and we've seen it in Slovakia. We've seen that nationalists have been tamed to become part in Europe. But once part in Europe, you can't ask them for more. I mean, in our book, I have a quotation from Alex Salmond, the famous Scottish nationalist, which is now 20 years old quotation. And what did Salmond say in 92, 93? He said, look at these nice fresh nations in former Yugoslavia. I mean, Scotland cannot settle for less than they did, which is their own country. You know, so in fact, he sought inspiration from former Yugoslavia. Okay, so let me say that I do not think that the identity issue is something where Europe has been stronger than nationalism. But the reason this didn't happen is that also we have to understand the EU for what it is, and I am part of this camp, you know, that we are very factionalist when it comes to European integration. I am part of the camp which always presume that European integration is the pursuit of national interest by better means, more or less. And if you look in European surveys, and if you see Lucas Tsoukalis remarked yesterday that our support is going down, but you have to see who supported us, I mean, who supported the European project. The European project was always significantly supported more by people who stood to win out of European project, by people who are more educated, higher on skills, who take advantage of the European freedom, by entrepreneurs. It's them who have always driven support for EU integration. And if today we seem to be doing less well than we did, it's simply because we are in a good moment. Now there is, you know, what in Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence is called reasonable doubt that for some people or some constituencies, EU is so much better than all the other alternatives. And I think that this is something that people, you know, are entitled to doubt, and they are entitled to debate. And the moment when we manage economically to put Europe back into shape, I'm absolutely convinced that our support will grow again. It just didn't happen yet. So, interest. We have to prove that Europe is still the better deal, that Europe is still the better alternative. Right? For a nationalist in Catalonia, Europe is a better alternative without Spain, because this is how regional funds work. So the moment then we created the system of incentives, let's just not be surprised that this is, you know, how it happens. But that's not the case for the, you know, for the nationalist in Serbia. For him, Europe still works best, and we can rely on this. Where the incentives are wrong, we simply have to try to correct these incentives. So on identity, I'm not optimistic, because I am originally a social psychologist, so I really don't believe in in invented nations. I mean, we would have invented Europe long ago, looking how much money we put in the European identity, if this is something that we could invent, right? So I consider European identity to simply be support for our political project. We are the Europeans, people who want to solve these problems together, and nothing more than this. So identity not. Interest, we have to work them out. And I think that this is something which we're working at, but as you've heard in the last 2 days, there's still a way to go. And then there's borders, and with this I end, the 3 important elements where nations are concerned, right? What do we do about borders? I think that despite what we've heard about the Balkans and the difficulties that projects such as Bosnia have, because they've been exceptional from the start, I would rather think that somehow Balkans are considered within the EU border. They're part of a border that we can defend. The question is, of course, in the East, because we have never really discussed and we have never really talked with the Russians in the past 20 years to finally have an agreement where should Europe end in the East. And what we have been doing, and probably, rightly so, I praise some of the people who have been doing this, was simply to push Europe, taking advantage of the Russian weakness when they were looking elsewhere. And we did this to some extent. I would not say that we did this very successfully, because it's not easy to have such a project, but at least we have, kept up hope in places like Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. But now this has really, really come to an end, hasn't it? And I don't think that sneaking is going to help us. And the #1 victim of this ambiguity is, of course, Ukraine, because we tend, on one hand, to believe in nations. We're having this discussion, particularly the Americans. On the other hand, we live in an era where borders are very much protected. But we should not be afraid to say, although I know it sounds a bit scandalous, that the borders of Ukraine as they are now, they are the borders that Stalin and Khrushchev made. And these borders have only been sustainable as long as Russia agreed with these borders. But Russia has only agreed to these borders. And, like other people here, I've been there in the days of the fall of the Soviet Union, following the Minsk coup d'etat. I've been crossing from Moldova to Ukraine the very first day when Ukraine was created. And I've actually met this gentleman with a small folding table who was installing the first border post and who actually asked for money because he thought it's going to have to be a toll now that Ukraine is independent. So we gave him $1. This is my first contribution to the independence of Ukraine in that day. Russia agreed. Russia agreed because they thought, okay, they're going to be independent, but they're going to remain in the sphere of influence of Russia, because Russia always had the doctrine, regardless in what part of politics in Russia, you always heard the doctrine of legitimate influence in your neighborhood countries, What are we going to do now? I do not really believe that this is something that we can avoid discuss, and I do not know why we're not discussing. A nation is sustainable in certain borders. This applies to Ukraine, where I think that the creation of a Ukrainian nation is a big success. The problem is that they are a great nation. They showed us this in the last weeks, but they're not in the right borders. We also might be a great nation, the European Union, but we also are a bit insecure about our borders these days. How much of it can we really sustain? And the dreams about being really very influential beyond our borders in places like Egypt or Turkey, I think that this is also now past. We're not going to be as influential as we have been for quite a while. We really have to consolidate ourselves before having this kind of magic dreams that we had in the 90s. So I will sort of end up with this, saying that I would really believe that the Balkans are within the sustainable European border, and without much discussion and debate, you will see that gradually we are going to bring them in, the rest of it. But in the East, we are in the very unfortunate position, which we have been avoiding, but now we are there, of negotiating where Europe ends with the Russians. Thank you.
Thank you very much.